Hey, welcome all. We're so glad you're here. And I know, Beth, you're giving a great intro, but you're on mute.
Thanks. Sorry, mute buttons. We're so glad to have you all here. If you haven't done so already, please go to menti.com and type in the code 6872246 and let us know what council you're joining from. We're really excited about the work we have ahead of us today. Yesterday, we took the first step as a network to identify shared policy initiatives we could take to address as a statewide network. Today, we're going to take that thinking to the local council level. So over the next 90 minutes, we'll lay the groundwork for us to work within our local councils to be able to operationalize our policy agendas. And a big chunk of that time today, we'll be hearing from Jen Powis of Boulder Advocacy. She'll be sharing an incredibly informative training on Advocacy 101. She'll address how to work within the law, steps in campaign building, and helping us identify some tools to move forward. She'll share some important legal tips as we enter into the advocacy world collectively, both at an organizational level over the next year. Additionally, we're really excited to have Dawn Arteaga from Institute for Conservation Leadership joining us. She'll be bringing her adept facilitation skills to support our work this afternoon. Dawn?
Thanks so much, Beth. It's really great to be with you all. I really enjoyed the session yesterday and especially appreciated all the energy and idea generation that I saw in action. So I'm looking forward to seeing more of that in play today. And just want to let you know, even though we are getting a great presentation from Jen today, don't think you can just put Zoom on auto drive. There are going to be some moments of interaction, as you saw already. So thanks to all of you who entered in what local council you belong to. We'd love for everyone to make active use of the chat in Zoom. Introduce yourself. Since this is a Zoom meeting, you can see each other and say hello. So please feel free to be actively using the chat today. As you know, we also have a notes document, which Angela just posted in the chat so that you can follow along. And we'd actually love your help today. Since this is an active network full of great people with great ideas, if you can help populate the notes with the things that stood out to you today, we would love for this to be a shared notes doc. So it's as useful for everyone as possible. And I see some intros coming through on the chat. So welcome, Nancy, Lauren, Gabe, Rachel. We're so glad you are all here. This is great. All right, so we're gonna start off with, I'm glad we're doing intros. So that's a good warm way to get warmed up. So make sure you're saying hi to your friends and the people who you remember seeing at each of these summits each year. And we're going to do some things on Menti too. So I would recommend, if it's easy, if you have a phone by your side and you can open up a browser on your phone and go to menti.com and enter in that code there, 6872246. We're going to ask another question. And it's related a little bit to the environment that we're all in right now. You know, especially when we have kind of a big national moment as we've all just lived through a very divided election. And then we're entering in this work together of thinking about planning and what policy changes do we want. Sometimes something that can hold us back from moving full steam into that exciting work of imagining change is some concerns or some holdups that might be weighing you down. I like to call these stinky fish. So we're going to spend a few minutes working together to throw our stinky fish on the table collectively right now. And so I'm going to give you a minute just to kind of sit and think about the thing that maybe concerns you the most about making policy change in your local council over the next year, maybe the next 6 months, given the environment that we're in right now. And I'm going to flip over to this slide here. So think about what's that stinky fish. That's kind of just, it could be the elephant in the room or, you know, whatever the thing is that's kind of holding you back. What is a concern you have about the food policy landscape? We're going to throw all these out onto the table now. So go ahead into menti.com and enter in that code and we'll let them come through. Yeah, I see funding for the work. That's real. Keep them coming. What other stinky fish do we need to throw on the table? What's holding you back? What's a concern? Soaring food insecurity given the global pandemic? Absolutely. People who are focused on division? Yes. It's hard sometimes when you get caught up in these divided times to think about possibilities. That's real. Feeling like maybe food isn't the biggest policy priority. Maybe there's other things holding you back. Yeah, these are all really good. Political will. What is inclusive literature in this environment, right? Severe food security needs overriding progress on environmental and social sustainability. Dependency on executive whim, nationally and statewide. Sustainability, a lack of organizational capacity, not having enough staff to work on all that's needed. These are really good. Hits to immigrant farm worker populations, continued decline in family farms. There are not enough small farm voices in the room to speak firsthand about regenerative and sustainable practices and monetary needs from the state. I see a lot of people noting capacity challenges, financial challenges. This is real. Sustaining the momentum for change. Need for collective impact, collaboration. Well, I'm happy to see that one there. Need for collective impact and collaboration. Because the ideas that we're generating today are just the kinds of things that could potentially be taken up with collective impact with other colleagues that are here in this meeting with you today, or maybe those who are watching the recording. Hello to all of you who might be watching this as a recording. Interesting, little to no support for beginning farmers, a loss of biodiversity, having the right people at the table. That's a big one. And after you submit your idea, you should be able to scroll through this so you can make sure to give as much space to this. It's such a helpful thing to get these out. And thank you for taking the time to get those stinky fish out into the room. Now let's take a collective breath because we know, if nothing else, we know we are resilient and we can keep moving forward. And to that point, we're going to have some great education today. So I'm going to move us forward and we can still keep going back to those. But as we get into the mindset of learning from Jen now in just a few minutes, we're going to do a fun little quiz. So to the best of your knowledge, as a nonprofit employee, are you allowed to lobby? Yes or no? As an unincorporated association member, maybe a grassroots food council member, are you allowed to lobby? Yes or no? And as a volunteer for a nonprofit, are you allowed to lobby? And as a government employee, are you allowed to lobby? Okay, I see one person's answered. If you're not noticing it, you do need to hit refresh sometimes. Yes, it's Menti, M-E-N-T-I. Apologies if I had a typo in a previous one. Yeah, you might need to hit next question to see this. I see we've got 8 responses in so far. Keep them coming, guys. Looks like our consensus is leaning. Oh, we're moving a little towards the nose, or is it yes? We got 19 responses in here, 20. I'll stop in a minute. Okay, it looks like most people are thinking definitely yes for unincorporated association members. Nonprofit employees, we're less sure, but still leaning toward the yes column. And government employees are also maybe a little less sure, but it looks like we're leaning toward yeses. Okay. Okay, perfect. I'm going to stop sharing now so that I can introduce our guest speaker today, Jen Pois. We're so glad you're here. For more than a decade, Jen has been a public interest attorney focused on ensuring nonprofits act as strong advocates. Her passion in particular focuses on supporting the public interest environmental community throughout the Gulf Coast. But she's worked with dozens of nonprofits, from schools to grassroots environmental justice groups. She was named a top lawyer for nonprofits in Houston for 3 years in a row, and has supported as general counsel for various nonprofits and individuals associated with public policy. So her session today is going to include legal tips on advocacy and lobbying that will help us build shared language so that we're all really clear when we're asked those questions. We're a strong yes or a strong no. Jen, we're so glad you're here. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Dawn, and thank you all so much for joining me today. I am very excited to present to you all, in part because I am originally from Cleveland, Ohio, and so I saw earlier there that at least a couple folks from Cuyahoga County. I'm based in Houston and am senior counsel with Alliance for Justice's Boulder Advocacy group and program. And basically that program provides lawyers across the nation to help nonprofits be as bold as possible in their advocacy. And so I've gotten to know a couple of the facilitators for this event, some of the policy issues that Ohio and some of these food councils are struggling with. And today, what I want to start with is really how I think about it as sort of leveling the playing field, making sure we're all using the same narratives. So as Dawn said, when we talk about whether or not you're permitted to lobby, well, what does that mean? And when we think about advocacy, what does that mean? No matter where you sit, if you're a nonprofit executive, if you're a volunteer, if you're a government worker that is also doing nonprofit work on the side, hopefully today's presentation is going to help you understand the language that lawyers use when we're talking about advocacy and what that means under the law, and then also embolden you to do more, to really unite your campaigns in a way, either through coalition or even just direct work that gets something positive done for your community, no matter where you are. And so with that intro, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we will start this presentation. So now I am an attorney. As I said, I'm senior counsel for the Boulder Advocacy Program. And like all good attorneys, right, we start with our disclaimers. And so while Boulder Advocacy has 10 attorneys across the nation that answer questions around nonprofit law every day, 8 to 5, Monday through Friday, for free, right? You can always call us. We can't be your attorney. And what that means is that you can't rely on the advice that we provide to you in any sort of court of law. But what we think of it as is technical assistance to the nonprofit community, again, so that you can do as much as possible within the law to get good policies across the finish line. So today we're going to talk about nonpartisan advocacy in partisan times. And I think, you know, when Dawn had talked about throwing your stinky fish onto the table, you know, so many of you were talking about funding, collaborative work. Do we have the right voices? Things that nonprofit execs are often very much focused upon. And in today's world, because it's become so partisan, so sort of us versus them, it's really difficult to have, I think, solid conversations about policies and about the economics that drive some of those policies. But hopefully, again, today's going to be that issue leveling, that narrative leveling, so that we're all speaking the same language when we try to approach these things. So
hey,
briefly,
Jen, I'm sorry to interrupt you,
sure.
But it's in presenter mode, not full screen mode. And I wonder if you could just flip that around so we can see the text a little bigger.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much.
Did that
Sorry
help?
to cut your flow.
That actually made it smaller on my side. So I have it as slideshow view.
Yeah, it's funny. We're seeing like a split screen where there's one slide that's small and then the next slide and your notes and everything. So it's a little smaller.
Oh, I'm very sorry.
There you go. Hide presenter view. I think that should do it. Hide presenter view.
There we go. Is that better?
Yep. Perfect. Thank you.
Excellent. No problem. So thank you, Dawn, for that. And I appreciate that. And as Dawn had said, you know, please take yourself off of mute. If you have questions, if you want to interrupt me, There's no problem here. That's a small group. And I actually asked for this to be more like a meeting as opposed to a webinar in order for us to really have this conversation. So please, if you have questions, put them in the chat. I promise to get to them by the end of the day. So here's the agenda, a couple of things that we're going to think about, right? So in order to talk about advocacy and talk about coalition work, we first have to define what we're talking about when we say a nonprofit, a 501c3 nonprofit or a 501c4 nonprofit, because both are actually nonprofit entities, but the rules surrounding what they can do are very different. We're then going to move to what is prohibited for all the nonprofits, which is that partisan political work for public charities. And then we're going to walk through lobbying examples and some coalition examples that I was able to pull, actually a couple of things that just got signed by your state legislature about a month ago or so. So with that, I wanted to emphasize about how, working in coalition often allows each entity that's at the table to play to its own strengths. And so when I was speaking with the facilitators about preparing for this presentation, we did a lot of talking about how some folks that are on this call really have multiple hats that they're wearing. Sometimes you're working for a governmental entity, and so your role may be more restricted in that role. For example, most governmental entities, city or counties, they have their own government affairs offices. It's really not up to you to go off and talk to legislators on your own without their approval. But then in your off hours, in your personal capacity, perhaps you're running a small nonprofit 501c3 in connection with the work that you do during your day job. And in that role, you have a different set of rules that are surrounding you. If you're working for a 501c3 public charity, perhaps, as you'll see here, partisan work is prohibited, so you can't endorse a candidate. But then you even have a third hat, right? You're a volunteer. You're a volunteer for some other entity. And in that hat, perhaps you can endorse a candidate. You could go into partisan politics because, again, each of those hats have different roles around the work that they can do. But so many of us share the load, share the work in different ways, that the point of this presentation is really to help you define where you sit and what you're doing, and then to hopefully showcase some opportunities for you to get some good work done. So to begin, the basics, that difference between the C3 and the C4, C5, C6s. So many of you may work for 501c3 public charities. Those are your typical nonprofits, and that's oftentimes what we think about when we say a nonprofit that we work for. They're receiving the most beneficial tax status underneath the IRS code. And because of that, there are some strings attached, right? The government's never going to give something out without a little bit of a string. And you'll see there where the blue arrow is. That benefit that they're receiving is that contributions to 501c3 public charities are tax deductible. And so if you think about the nonprofits that many of you probably work with, day in and day out, food banks, the United Way, YMCA, perhaps churches, synagogues, etc. Those are all 501c3 public charities. And when you give $1 to them, they actually give you a letter in return that says that that contribution was tax deductible for the donor, for the individual that has provided support to that public charity. Because of that tax status, because of that benefit provided to the donor, lobbying activities are limited for public charities. But please notice the box is only yellow, it is not red. Every 501c3 public charity can, in fact, lobby for change to their state, local, or federal elected officials. What they can't do, however, is they cannot support or oppose a candidate. Partisan activities are what are prohibited for 501c3 public charities, not policy work. In fact, public charities, that's sort of their sweet spot, right? If you're working for a nonprofit entity as a public charity, you are an expert in the work that you do, in your policy piece that you are working on. And because you're an expert, we actually hope that you talk to elected officials about the problem you see in your community, perhaps the budget constraints that you see in delivering a service to your community, and then propose solutions. And while that sounds like lobbying, and it probably is, depending on how specific you get with the solution, all of that is permitted for 501c3 public charities. Now, to compare that to 501c4 organizations, which are social welfare organizations, C5s, which are unions, or C6s, which are trade associations, they have a different provision under the code. And you'll see there that blue arrow again. While those entities are still nonprofits, they're still going to look and feel very much like a nonprofit. Contributions to them are not tax deductible, and that's the difference. Because they don't have that string attached, you'll see there the lobbying activities are unlimited. They can lobby up to 100% of their time about the problems that they see and what they'd like to see fixed. And then you'll see there the partisan activities, they can actually have that as a secondary activity. 49% of their time, they can actually do partisan activities. So when you see what looks like a nonprofit and it has endorsed a candidate, that is not a 501c3 public charity that has done that endorsement, right? They can't. That's not possible for the C3s. That's more likely a C4, a C5, and C6s. And that's, I think, the bulk of this confusion in the space so often, because the entities look the same from the outside, but this is really how they're reporting up their income to the federal government. And that's the difference. So how I like to think about this is this partisanship lens. So you'll see there on the left-hand side, the elephant and the donkey are sort of blaming each other, right? And we can all, take a deep breath after this federal election. I don't know about you all, but I was tired of the ads, right? So nonprofits, public charities that work in this space, right? Because they can't be partisan, our job as a nonprofit is to blame anyone sitting in the elected official seat. I'm the nonprofit executive and I have a problem in my community and I'm coming to government to say, this is a way we can fix this problem. Perhaps I need government to get out of the problem, or perhaps I need government to get in to create that solution. But either way, I don't care who's sitting there. Government needs to address the policy that I'm working on. You'll see there the C4, C5, C6s though, on the right-hand side of your screen, right? They're the ones that can say, oh, it's the Republicans' fault, or, oh, it's the Democrats' fault, or, oh, if it was only we had the Green Party candidate, we wouldn't have these issues here. That partisanship is what is prohibited for 501c3 public charities. And so when you see that type of language, when you're working in coalition and someone starts talking that way, you have to raise your hand and stop them if you work for the public charity, or at least then recognize that, look, they're a different type of entity and they're going to be able to do different types of strategies and tactics that you as the 501c3 public charity cannot do. So a little bit of a broken record here, but just to make it abundantly clear, 501c3 public charities cannot support or oppose any candidate for public office. So in these partisan times, I know we're after the election, but elections happen pretty routinely, right? That's what a 501c3 public charity can't do. So what does it mean to support or oppose though? And so I don't know how many of you have ever been down to Big Bend in Texas. It's a national park and a state park, but in the town of Lajitas, we actually have a goat as a mayor. And that's, Clay Henry right there. And so I give this as one of those great examples of what is supporting or opposing a candidate. A 501c3 public charity can never say vote for Clay Henry, right? It's absolutely prohibited. And that's an easy one. What's a little bit more difficult though, is how we determine partisanship. And so here again, with supporting or opposing candidates, right? When you see something that looks like a nonprofit entity here, the American Flood Coalition, and it says that that flood coalition has endorsed a candidate, right? That is not a C3. That has to be some sort of C4 organization because a C3 cannot support or oppose. So then again, how do we determine partisanship? And what the IRS has told us is for 501c3 public charities, the way we determine partisanship is that we do a facts and circumstances analysis. And I like that prism there on the left-hand side of your screen, because this is why the lawyers get these phone calls all the time. This is why Boulder Advocacy has a program to help the nonprofit community, because it's a holistic approach regarding the facts and circumstances of whatever communication the nonprofit is doing to see if it sort of leans into a candidate or leans into a party. And so the way we like to think about this is that it is a risk analysis. And so when we say a risk analysis, I'd like you to think about a spectrum of behavior. And so often, again, why we call ourselves Bolder Advocacy is because we want you to be as bold as possible in getting the policies you want done in your community. And so Knowing that it's a risk spectrum means that you can play it in extremely safe and never really get very close to that line. Or you can really push on policies and really call out elected officials for work that they are failing to do or work that they should be doing. So when you're considering and reviewing this facts and circumstances analysis, we have this sheet here that kind of gives some examples. You know, the IRS has not provided a checklist. It's not an easy sort of quantitative look. It's very much qualitative in that the IRS would look at a communication that the nonprofit would put out to see if it was in fact a partisan communication. And they would look at things like those on this screen. You know, do you actually reference a candidate? Is there some sort of external factor driving the timing? So for example, the federal government considering the food bill would be a reason why perhaps you all would get active. And that makes sense then. It's not necessarily motivated by an election coming up at the federal side, more than that's motivated by the bill that's coming up. It would look at things like, have you historically had communications in this same vein? So many of you have been doing this work for a number of years. You've been to this conference for a number of years. You've probably put out newsletters and tweets and done Facebook Live events about policy pieces related to your work before. And so that history actually helps you, right? Because it shows that you're active in the community on this problem. And so when you're holding elected officials accountable for their failures to act on that problem, well, it's in line with what you had been doing, election or not. So these are just some of the examples when we think about that risk analysis to determine whether or not you're being too partisan. And again, that's really, I'm only talking to the 501c3 public charities here. If you're a C4, C5, C6, right, you're allowed to be partisan. You're going to be on this other side here. But my understanding from the facilitators were that most of you are probably either working for government or working as a volunteer or working as a public charity. And so that's really, I focused my presentation on those folks. So here's an example, and I'm going to encourage you to take yourselves, you know, off mute here, because I've just talked to you about how every nonprofit is able to work on policy, right? Is able to push government officials on policy. And here we have a little cartoon that says, make hate wrong again. So do you think that this little cartoon is partisan?
No.
And who said that?
This is Dawn.
Nice, Dawn.
I would say no also.
Good.
I would agree.
What if I told you they dropped this cartoon 2 weeks before the election and they were a new nonprofit group that had not done this work before?
Maybe.
I mean, they're not naming a specific candidate. It's an issue that they're talking about, right?
Maybe it's the word again that's tripping me up.
Would it depend on what the particular parties had been advertising in their own ads locally?
Well done, whoever said that.
There's
It
Nancy.
absolutely depends. Yep. Because think back to my examples on this facts and circumstances analysis. Just looking at the cartoon, I agree with all of you that said, no, it's just a cartoon, right? It's not talking about a candidate. It's not doing anything. Sure, it sort of references a candidate slogan by implication, but it's clearly not. But what the IRS has said is that's true, except when we have nonprofits that are motivated by an election or motivated by sort of leaning into a candidate in some other way. That's when the IRS will care about your work and think that you have violated the code provisions. And again, the only reason we're worried about this is one, you know, obviously it's a compliance strategy, right? Everybody that works, we're all in a regulated environment. We all try to follow the laws. it's not that IRS is going to be watching everybody's Facebook piece and come down on you, right? And all that would happen. I mean, you can lose your tax status, but more typically you would have to pay a tax on the work that was deemed partisan. But it's really the optics, right? If you're a nonprofit, there's an expectation that nonprofits are sort of working well within the rules of the game and being bold in what they want to articulate, perhaps be doing direct service, but understanding how to get things done in the right way. And so you don't really want to look like you're favoring one side or the other because you're trying to be more apolitical and focused only on the policies. And so whoever said, it depends on what was being talked about, I think is exactly right. And we give this as an example, and during the election season, we actually have 4 or 5 slides on it and change what the candidates had been saying about it. Because you could see how, for example, if this was in a local city council race where GLBTQ issues were on the table and hate versus love were sort of the language that was being talked about, it could absolutely be a partisan cartoon. But for right now, where we sit, this looks like nothing more than a feel good, make hate wrong again kind of comment, working against hate. So well done on all of you for thinking that through. And the reason I start with that facts and circumstances analysis is because so often, and it even happened to me today, someone walks through this presentation and you think to yourself, well, am I allowed to really talk about policies? Am I allowed to say, we hope Senator Cruz will support the bill? And the answer is yes, absolutely. Policies are different than what partisan activities look like. And as a 501c3 public charity, the only thing that you are prohibited from doing is partisan activities. And so what does lobbying really look like? There are 2 main rules for 501c3 public charities to account for how many hours or dollars they spend on actual lobbying, actual policy work related to lobbying. The default rule is what we call the activities test. And that means that every 501c3 public charity, if you have gotten your letter of determination from the IRS that you are a nonprofit, a 501c3 public charity, then you are allowed to lobby so long as it is an insubstantial part of your organization's activities. That's the default rule. What Boulder Advocacy often encourages our nonprofit community to do is to take an extra step and file for the 501H election. And the reason is because that is the expenditures test. And underneath that expenditures test, you'll actually do a little math equation, and then you'll have a number, a known amount that you can actually spend on lobbying. And it's just a little bit easier for tracking purposes. The way we think about this is that when you're under the insubstantial part test, you'll see here the definition grabs a little bit broader activities. It's a narrative form. So when you file your 990 at the end of the year, you actually have to describe how you advocated and lobbied for whatever policy you were on. And so it's a little bit of a qualitative test, if you will, versus for the 501H election, the definition is split into two parts, excuse me. And either you can directly lobby a legislator, which is some sort of communication to a legislator expressing a view about legislation, right? It's very narrow and it's very specific. Or there's grassroots lobbying, which is communication to the general public about a bill, but with a call to action, actually asking the public to call that legislator and say, vote yes on HB 10 or whatever it is. So the main difference is again, because 501H election has a very defined and succinct definition for lobbying, there's things that 501H specifically excludes that we believe would perhaps be required to be submitted underneath the insubstantial part test. And a big one for this group is whether or not volunteers are used for lobbying. So under the insubstantial part test, because you have to just describe your activities, if you are the staffer and you're leading a lobby day at your state legislative house, you would have to describe that whole day and include how many volunteers were there, et cetera, in your narrative. Under the 501H, because it's an expenditures test, you have to account for your staff time, right? So your time is counted, but all of those volunteer time, none of that counts because it's volunteer time. So it makes it a little bit easier from an accounting side on the back end, we believe. And also I think is just really allows you to do more because so much of our work, right, as nonprofits, we're relying on volunteers to do that work. So again, this expenditure test under the 501H. Now I'm an attorney, so I don't do math regularly, but we actually have a link on our website. And I'll put it in the chat here while you guys are in your breakout rooms. But you just do a little calculation, and it's basically 20% of your total expenditures up to the first $500,000. And that gives you a defined amount. And here you see we give this example of a $250,000 organization, which is, you know, a small to medium-sized organization, right, can spend 50 grand overall on lobbying. And here's the math formula that's available on the website. So if you haven't taken that 501H election and you are a nonprofit executive, a public charity, please consider doing so and feel free to reach out to me directly if you need some help with that. So because you all are working in a very regulated environment and actually sort of formulated from the state, right? I do want to point out that while lobbying is permissible with these philanthropic dollars, and we have these two tests for all public charities, that perhaps if some of you are receiving federal dollars, there may be additional restrictions within those federal dollar buckets. Most nonprofits or most coalitions, right? Some entities are receiving federal dollars, some are sort of hodgepodging federal, state, and then local dollars. So you do need to review your grants and your grant agreements to sort of trace your dollars. But I have yet to find anyone working in sort of a nonprofit, public entity, public charity perspective where they couldn't find any dollars that they could say, you know, those I can use, those are unrestricted dollars, I can use those for lobbying. But it is always important for us to point that out. So before I go on, we're going to look at a specific example that was recently walked through your state house. Perhaps some of you are familiar with the Buzzed Bull Creamery's request to sell more alcoholic ice cream. I thought I found a really pretty fun example for you all. But before we go to this example, does anyone have questions about what I just provided?
I haven't seen any questions come through the chat yet, Jen, so I think we're good to continue, but it is good to remember, just keep popping them into the chat as you think of things, and we'll make sure we have time to answer them.
Thanks, Dawn. So let's use this recent example, and we're going to assume that a 501c3 public charity had filed for the 501h election. And so again, you have your definitions of what is direct lobbying, right? Communication to a legislator expressing a specific view about legislation. And then the grassroots lobbying, communication to the general public about a specific legislation with a call to action. And that's the key piece for grassroots, right? You have to actually ask the public to contact their legislator and say, vote yes on the bill. So perhaps some of you have been following this. This House Bill 160 was filed nearly a year and a half ago to allow Buzzed Bull Creamery to ship alcoholic ice cream, which, I mean, I got to tell you, when I was Googling around for examples for this presentation, that is not one that I thought I would find. But here's a little picture of their from their website. And here is the bill that was introduced originally by Representative Ingram, who is out of Cincinnati. And so you'll see here, as you think about your policy pieces, and I understand from yesterday, many of you had a lot of great ideas about activities you wanted to get done. And so as you sort of start to drill down on those pieces, at least a few of them are going to require some sort of action at the state level, right? And so you're going to have to find a legislator to write a bill or to amend a piece of law similar to what Buzzed Bull Creamery did. And so again, we're assuming you have that 501h election. And so we want to walk through those elements, because if you communicate to Representative Ingram by email, letter, phone, and tell her or her staff that you support HB 160, right, which would change this law to allow Buzzed Bull to send this alcoholic ice cream, right? That is a direct lobbying communication. And we would just walk through that analysis, and that's how you would know whether or not your time was spent lobbying. And again, there's no problem here for you to do so. It's really just that you have to, on the back end, keep track of it. But there's no prohibition on any of this work at the policy level. So what if instead, though, you were actually somewhat concerned that they were going to be shipping alcoholic ice cream, and all you saw in this bill was that they had to say alcohol was enclosed. And you were very concerned about this, and instead you wanted to call Representative Ingram, right, or your local legislator, and you wanted to say, we also want on the package the phrase, do not open unless 21 added, right? So you have a direct and specific ask of the legislator to change the bill that's being considered. That too is a direct lobbying communication, right? Because you've called them, your local legislator or Representative Ingram, and you've told them, this is what I want added, and you've even highlighted the provision where it would show up, right? And this is all good advocacy. And really not that scary if you think about it. You know, so often I mean, lobbyists get a bad rap, and I'm sure some of them deserve it by all means, but the idea of going to your elected official and saying, this is the problem we have in the community, you know, this is the old law that's still there, or perhaps I want to get you out of this area of regulatory space, and saying what you need to solve this problem. That's really all the nonprofits trying to do when they are urging advocacy and lobbying. And so here, District 160, again, in Cincinnati, that's Representative Ingram. If you could call her, she wrote the bill. And here on you can go on to the state's website and do a little research on the bill, right? So on this one, this was actually already signed in to law by your governor, but it actually shows the votes, and you would know who was in opposition to the bill and who supported the bill. So that would help you in your advocacy, right? Because you could then direct your advocacy to someone either that you needed to persuade or perhaps tell them to vote no on it. But it's not just about the bill author, right? You also want to figure out from for this work what committee does this bill first go to, and who sits on that committee? And then perhaps, as many of you put initially, you're across the state in a variety of different places, right? So who's your local representative? And what do they think about this bill? Sure, they didn't write it. They might not have ever even heard of it. But if the bill is important to you and your constituency, your people that you're representing, as you speak to these elected officials, then tell them about it. Educate them about why this matters, and why you think it would be important sort of food policy for the state of Ohio. So now into this, again, we've selected that 501H election. And you saw that there were two very succinct definitions of lobbying: direct lobbying, which we just gave some examples of, and now we're moving to grassroots lobbying. And really the difference for grassroots lobbying is when you have a call to action to the public, when you're asking the public to call the legislator and say, you know, vote yes or no on a bill or change it, some sort of direct communication about specific legislation. And so the keys for call to action is that you actually have to tell the public to contact the legislators, and you have to provide a way for them to do that. A phone number, the address, if you think about a postcard, nowadays everything's by email, some sort of mechanism so that when you ask the public to call the legislator, they can do so, and you've basically made it easy for them to do. And obviously identifying the legislators you want them to call. So here's another one for y'all. This again, it's passed, right? This is not even a month ago, about a month ago today. Here's her press release. So it sounds like Buzzed Bull Creamery alcoholic ice cream is coming to a town near you. If you support this bill, can the nonprofit thank Representative Ingram? What do you guys think? I got some thumbs up, so that's positive. Is everyone like, oh my gosh, really? This is what we're going to talk about? I'm telling you, even I was surprised. I didn't know that alcoholic ice cream was even a thing.
Now we
So
know what to order for the next conference.
Right? we would start getting a lot more conversation. So yes, of course, the nonprofit can thank the representative. Now here, let's give this one as an example. And this one is outside your policy area, but this is West Virginia. And this was a tweet that's just said, hey, Medicaid expansion for pregnant women is up now in the Senate Health Committee. Is that lobbying?
No.
Anyone else?
I don't think so.
Good, Rachel, you're right. It is not lobbying because there's no call to action. And so you can see how when you're thinking about your advocacy, even as a quasi-governmental entity, right, informing the public about the paths that bills have to take through city council, county government, or the state legislator, or even the feds, right, when we start getting to the farm bill. Just informing the public about where it is in the process is not lobbying. That's just good advocacy. To make the process of how a bill becomes a law more transparent is absolutely within the nonprofit public charity sort of wheelhouse. Because again, if you think about the whole purpose of being a charity, it is to inform, right? To educate, to try to solve problems in our communities on a day-to-day basis that we're all working on. And there's no one more knowledgeable than you on food policy topics for Ohio, right? That's why you're spending your daytime job doing all of this work. And so pushing out this information without that call to action, totally not lobbying, just good advocacy. Same with, you'll see the thank you. And that's why, again, the nonprofits can thank Representative Ingram for her work on alcoholic ice cream, right? It's just saying, hey, look, passed, right? This is great. Took a while, but hey, that's super. And whoever their hashtags are, I have no idea. So just a few last minute notes on the lobbying piece. So even if it's not a bill, if it's something, a good idea that you have sort of fleshed out, for example, my hope is that maybe yesterday, some of you talked about, what if we got a model act that we try to get in every city regarding some sort of food policy piece that y'all wanted. Something of that nature, if it's fully fleshed out, even if it's not totally written down or not yet introduced, that's still specific enough to perhaps count for lobbying. If you go to a representative and you say, this is sort of what we're thinking, we want you to file a bill on this. That's close enough that that's going to count as lobbying. Again, you saw the stop sign before, right? Can't be partisan, can't oppose or support candidates for office, even goats, in case any of you are ever in Texas. But 501c3s can engage in education and advocacy all day long. And so with those definitions that we just talked about for lobbying, you can see here's all of these other pieces that are really best practices for strong nonprofits that are bold in their work. And none of this is lobbying. So for example, administrative advocacy is not lobbying, particularly when there's no call to action, right? So we're just talking about how NEPA is a good bill and we think it's important. No call to action, not lobbying. Advocacy on regulation. So this is regulations that affect food policy nationwide that are perhaps printed in the CFR at the federal level, right? And it's like they ask for public comments on a rule that they're thinking about. Perhaps it's SNAP payments, perhaps it's organic regulations, whatever it may be, right? That's not lobbying. That's just good advocacy to put your comments in writing and submit them to the government in whatever way or form you can. Advocating for or against an executive order is not lobbying. Perhaps you all really supported Governor DeWine's idea about allowing food trucks to give out food at Ohio rest stops, during the initial shutdown for the pandemic, right? Maybe you absolutely hated that idea. Either way, that advocating for or against that executive order, it's not lobbying because he's an executive. He's not making new laws, right? That think back to those definitions about lobbying, and it's got to be a specific piece of legislation, a law that you're trying to change with a legislator. Working to change the enforcement of existing laws, also not lobbying. Couldn't really find a good one in the food policy space for this, But if you're talking about an act that's currently perhaps maybe being overly enforced or maybe under enforced, and so it's not really allowing a fair playing field with farmers markets in your community or something of that nature, working to change how the government enforces the laws that are on the books, not lobbying. Litigation, not lobbying, right? And so understanding sort of where the intersection of the budgets from the federal, the state, and your local dollars are coming from, and perhaps noticing a problem within that space, suing the city over it in some way, that's not lobbying. And also a lot of entities that perhaps you all work with quite frequently, right? They're not legislators. And so likely the work that you're doing at those spaces is not lobbying. So if you think about school boards, zoning boards, housing authorities, special purpose bodies, those are implementing commissions. The legislators have already made the law. These are the boards that normally aren't even elected. Most of the time they're appointed in some way. And they're really there just to implement the law in some fair, hopefully reasonable way. So going to them and talking about how we need different zoning for food trucks, we need different zoning for markets, farmers markets, we need different zoning to conserve more land and to resuscitate wetlands in some way. None of that is lobbying. That's just all good advocacy that you all can absolutely do. So if your activity does not have all the elements of lobbying, then it's not lobbying, and it doesn't need to be sort of carved out and reported. But really the bulk of this presentation was to encourage and to sort of level that playing field again with the understanding that all 501c3 public charities can in fact absolutely lobby. That's not the problem. The policy work's not the problem. It's that partisanship that the 501c3 public charities and government officials need to be concerned about. So now coalition work, right? How do we get it done when we're working in coalition? Because normally when we're working in coalition, we have everybody at the table. The C3 public charities, the volunteers, the government entities, the unions, and maybe some goats. So first, again, remember to review your grant agreements. If you are somehow funded with federal dollars, even federal dollars that are passed through the state and then show up in your house, look back at your grant agreements, find those local philanthropic dollars that you can do this work with, because usually federal dollars are going to be somehow restricted. But utilize resources so that you can be intentional in your work. And so this advocacy resource coalition checklist over here on the left-hand side of your screen, I'm going to put that into the chat while you all are in your breakout groups. But this is a 16-page guide that basically walks you through best practices in how to form coalitions and intentionally form coalitions so that everybody understands the do's and don'ts of the relationship. And you can see there, I have a sample coalition operating agreement, right? Because the purpose of working in coalition is because nonprofits are often stronger when we work together, right? Because we show a bigger base. We show that we are representative of more constituents. And so we tend to get more attention when we work in coalition with others. But when working in coalition with others, we have to be mindful not to talk for them, right? And that was interesting to me to see in some of your initial comments to Dawn's question about how, well, we don't have local farmers at the table. What are we doing to protect family farms? How are we really supporting the community in a way that makes sense for them instead of just sort of being the ivory tower-ish, if you will, thinking about policy from policy's perspective without actually meeting people where they're at. And so when working in coalition, it's super important to meet those people where they're at and then to understand when you can speak and when you can't, when it's best to allow them to speak for themselves, and when you sort of frame out the work that you want to do together to get some sort of policy change done. Much of this work is often around budgets, and budgets count for policy, right? A line item in the budget is just like a new law. And so when you lobby an elected official to increase that line item or to protect that line item, that's still going to count as lobbying. But again, there's so much advocacy you can do outside of lobbying that the purpose of this presentation was really to encourage you to think about the policy objectives you decided on yesterday and understand the rules of the game, understand what the public charities can do, what the C4s can do, and really what the volunteers can do. So finally, the last piece here is in your individual hat. And I think I'm right on time, it's 3:55. So again, all of you, no matter where you sit today, you're probably at work. So either you're working for your government entity, you're working for the public charity, perhaps you're just a leading advocate in this space and a volunteer. But you have different hats and you speak in different voices depending. And so all of you have a hat when you're just you as yourself as an individual. And what often can happen is if you're well known in the community that you work for, the university, or you work for the Food Council, and it's a government, quasi-governmental role, it's important that you be clear if you ever do things sort of outside that role. And we actually have sample policies on our website for all nonprofits. We encourage nonprofit public charities to adopt a policy that says, look, you absolutely have a right to be partisan in your own time. You have a right to volunteer for other organizations in your own time. But when you're doing so, make sure you don't wear our shirt that's embroidered, right, with our logo on it. Make sure you stand up in the meeting and say, hey, my friend is running for city council. I'm not here representing the Food Policy Council today. I'm actually here in my individual capacity. We went to high school together, and I cannot think of anyone better to run for city council. That's all fine and good. It's just be clear with what hat you have on and when. And that goes a long way towards any public charities compliance strategy. So with that, again, I'm an attorney that works for Boulder Advocacy, and we have 10 attorneys across the nation. We answer questions related to these topics 8 to 5 every day at that 1-866 number that you currently see on your screen. The law is often, difficult to manage, and everything is nuanced. And the IRS has then given us this great, facts and circumstances test, so that during an election season, everyone's sort of in a panic about whether or not they're trying to be too partisan or not. So if you ever have questions about this, feel free to call. We've also got a podcast that sort of geeks out on all this stuff that I would totally encourage you to listen to. It's called Rules of the Game for a reason, because Boulder Advocacy, our hope is that when we do these presentations, we help you be intentional about the work that you're going to do. And we hope that you can be as bold as possible in your advocacy so you can get the job done. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Dawn because she's going to break you out into individual groups.
Awesome. Well, let's just celebrate, Jenna. If you want to take yourself off mute for a second, just give her a little applause. That was a really great presentation. I know. Yes, we got a lot out of it.
Thanks.
Yeah, and feel free to turn your videos on so this can be, a bit more like a circle at this point. Thanks. I did see a few questions popping up in the chat, and I think you did answer some of them as you were going, Jen, but it sounded like it might be helpful to talk a little bit more about the filing the H. Sorry, now I'm losing the specific word.
The 501H election. So you're absolutely right. It is an election. So you are still a 501c3 public charity. You're still a nonprofit. It's a one-page form that you file. And lawyers are not creative speech, right? We're not graphic designers. 501H just refers to the provision in the code where this is found, and it's the expenditures test for lobbying. What I can do is actually link to you the one-page form that you'll file with the IRS. And once you check that box, you don't even get anything back from the IRS, right? They don't even respond to you. It's just then at the end of the year when you file your 990, you say, yes, I've made the H election and I've spent $20,000 on direct and grassroots lobbying. And then that's it. You don't have to give that narrative like you do if you don't make that H election. If you don't make that H election, you fall underneath the insubstantial part test. You actually have to fill out Schedule C for your 990. And it's going to ask you, well, how did you lobby? What did you lobby on? And then you have to be mindful of describing the work because you have to think about all the different ways you perhaps did that lobbying. So that's the difference there. And I'll put them in the chat for y'all when you split out.
Awesome. Noreen, did that answer the question you were raising about it? Or did you have anything further you wanted to ask Jen about that filing?
Oh, my question wasn't specifically for Jen. It was asking if anybody who's on the Zoom right now has the 501H. Honestly, I'd never heard of that before. So it's very interesting and helpful. Thank you.
Welcome.
Noreen, I've worked for organizations that have done that filing.
Is there a reason not to do it? It seems like it's something that we should be doing, and why not do it?
Looks
So
like you're
off-
getting lots of nods.
Yeah. So often the only reason why Boulder Advocacy would suggest that perhaps you not is if your expenditures are over 17 million. And that's because the way the math works, that if you're that big of an organization, perhaps you would actually be permitted to do more lobbying in the narrative form than in the expenditures test. But most nonprofits that Boulder Advocacy works with, most of my clients when I was in private practice, right, are 5 million and below. And it makes no sense not to. In part, it also provides, I have found, great clarity for your board. So often a nonprofit executive gets pushback from their board because the board thinks lobbying is a dirty word. It's political. You're not supposed to be doing it. They're not really quite understanding that difference between policy work and partisan work. And so then when you tell them, look, we did this 501H, and in fact, I can spend $150,000 on lobbying. So I'm going to pay $75,000 to this person in Austin who's going to do all of it and not worry about it. And we're going to go get this bill done in a coalition. The board gets that, right? The board's like, oh yeah, that makes total sense, right? It's an expenditure. Get it. Totally understand that. You're in Austin. We're going to get, or sorry, Austin, I should say Columbus for you all. You're going to get something done. And that makes a lot of sense to them. And so that's, other than that, I can't think of really other reasons why you would not want to do that. And I'll put it in the link for y'all in the chat.
Great. And thanks, Jody, for adding that foundations also have that option. Great.
So quickly, just Casper's question about, is there a difference between lobbying and advocacy? And yes, I think there really is. In part because when we talk about advocacy, we're including everything related to a nonprofit's work to educate elected officials. But you can see that even under the insubstantial part test, only a small part of that is lobbying, is actually talking directly to a elected official to get a bill done. And so I see in the chat somewhere that, someone talks about how an executive order is a loophole. It's not really a loophole. Lobbying is, the definition is a bill, a law, and there's 3 branches of government, right? And so when we're talking to the governor's office, the governor can't make new laws. The governor is really an administrator. He can apply the laws in a certain way. And so advocating on those executive orders is just that, it's advocating, it's not lobbying.
Great. That's super helpful. And I think the other 2 questions that were raised in chat did get answered in your presentation. There was one on federal grants contain lobbying restrictions. And I heard you say, yes, that is the case in most cases.
And that's the thing. Again, look at those grant agreements. So I pulled CBD GDR appendix, which is the community block grants. And the restrictions on lobbying for community block grants are really related to lobbying on specific contracts, not necessarily new policies. So again, pull those grant agreements. And if you have a question about whether that grant agreement would restrict your ability to lobby on a policy piece, pay the $250 to $300 to an hour to a lawyer to review the agreement and give you a letter in response. And so that's really the difference between Boulder Advocacy and what an attorney can do in your local community, right? If you get that letter from the attorney saying, look, your grant agreement doesn't say this, you could go lobby on this. You can rely on that if the IRS ever asked you a question about it. We can't do that. We really just provide the guardrails for y'all.
Excellent, thanks. And Rachel, thank you for posting a link to a guide on advocacy versus lobbying for everyone to take a look at. I'll make sure that's included in our shared notes doc. Okay, so Casper has a clarifying question here.
I like that. I like that. So advocacy is not necessarily lobbying. Yes, I think lobbying is always going to be advocacy. I hate to say that so definitively though, because one, I'm a lawyer, right? The lawyer's favorite phrase is, it depends. But generally speaking, yes. And so I think it's in part why we do the training when I talk about the C3s and the C4s, and we try to do that level playing field so that we're all using the same narrative, the same terminology, because for us, that's a correct statement. That's how Boulder Advocacy thinks about it. might not be how your board thinks about it. And so I'd hate to sort of make it a black and white issue for them. And then they say, well, you can't do any advocacy, right? And that's a horrible idea.
Awesome. And then Beth wanted to make sure, and I think you covered this when you talked about the coalition work, but the rules that you outlined in such great detail don't apply to grassroots orgs that are not 501c3s, correct?
Great question. So if you are an unincorporated association within your state, it is likely that the restrictions around the amount of lobbying don't apply to you because you're an unincorporated entity. And so depending on where you are an unincorporated entity and depending on Ohio law as it relates to unincorporated entity, I can't say one way or the other what you would have to file for the state. So for example, if you receive all your dollars in and you put them in a bank account, right, that may be taxable then to the state in some way. So that's a very specific question you'd have to address there. But the lobbying rules in general only apply to entities that have then asked the IRS for that 501c3 public charity tag.
Okay. So likely you're okay, but consult a lawyer to be sure.
Well, and really it's for sure you're okay. It's just if you're an unincorporated association, right, and you've not received 501c3 tax status, you can't give a letter in return to a donor saying that they've contributed to a nonprofit, right? Because they haven't, right? You could not say that the money that you've received doesn't have to be reported to the state for state income tax, right? That's something I know Ohio has and Texas doesn't, right? So those are the questions that you'd have to sort of follow up with the lawyer. But for sure, you should do the work. That's not the problem. You should be bold in whatever advocacy you're doing.
Bold and bolder.
Bold and bolder. That's right.
All right. Great. Well, Jen, thank you so much. That was wonderful. And as questions come up, Jen's still with us for the next hour. So we still have access to this excellent legal resource as we continue to get down into specifics and talk more. So every year at the summits, one of the things that people cite as the thing that they love most about coming together in the summit is that chance to get to interact and to get to know people you might not get to know otherwise in a virtual setting. That obviously is a little harder at times, but we're going to give it a try. And so I hope you will be good sports and stick with us. I know it's towards the end of the day, and I know you've probably been on a lot of calls, but we're going to do some breakout rooms in just a minute so that you can get a chance to talk together in small groups on specifically this, how to take the policy agenda down into your local council level. So if you joined yesterday, you'll remember that we talked through the 4 big policy priorities in the statewide agenda, and they fall under local farms, access and education, infrastructure, and institutions. So I'll give people a chance to peruse this, and if you have clarifying questions or if this isn't familiar and you just want to kind of have someone talk it through, I'll give you a chance to look at these now, make sure that they're all clear. I think they are, and I think we talked them through yesterday. So I'll just give a pause. All right, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna set up 4 different groups, and you'll be invited to join a breakout room. You'll get a little note on your screen and you'll just hit join. It's very simple. And then you'll be in a group probably of about 8 to 10 people. And you're gonna talk through taking the work from yesterday into the local council level. You're gonna discuss these 2 key questions. 1, what policy idea or action do you see having the biggest impact on the challenges you face in your local council? So we started this discussion talking about some of those big environmental challenges we're all grappling with. We heard Jen talk through some very specific things and some very real possibilities for actions. What are some ideas that are popping for you that feel like you could get some momentum around and could really have an impact on your work? And then the second question is, what relationships would need to be formed in your council in order to see this policy move forward? Any clarifying questions on those? And I see Jen's already popped up the resources she promised us. She was good on her promise, so we'll make sure to include those in the notes document so everyone can refer back to them. All right, Angela, how are you feeling about the group setup? Are we in good shape on setting up breakout rooms?
Yep, I'm ready when you are. Do we need
Okay,
to
cool.
post in the chat the document?
Yeah, if you could go ahead and post that to the chat, or sorry, I was supposed to do that, wasn't I?
Nope, I'm on it.
Okay, thank you. That was my job. Okay, so just wanted to, so these are the two questions you're gonna talk about. You're gonna have 15 minutes in small groups, and very generously, members of the steering committee have volunteered to help facilitate so that everyone gets a chance to speak. Jen and I are going to stay in the main room, and if we're needed, we'll pop into your room. So your facilitator has the way to bring us in, and we'll come in if needed. But you have 15 minutes to work in your groups. And as you do, when you kick off, make sure you assign a note taker. You each have Google Docs to track those two discussion questions there in the chat. And make sure you assign a presenter, because when we come back together, we're going to want to hear the specific ideas you've brainstormed in your group that you think could have an impact. All right, is everyone ready? All right, have a great time. We'll see you in 15 minutes.
Of emergency. So, you know, if you're a big school and you're buying food from a food hub, right? Like that's pretty easy to do. But what happens if, you know, you need to kind of split down those large packs of food because maybe school's not in session now? How do you do that? How do you get from point A to point B with this big cheese wheel that you can no longer use at a restaurant, but you need to process that down so that it's available for something like a food pantry or a soup kitchen or a community access in times of emergency. And also a baseline map was also talked about. And I love mapping when it comes to infrastructure. I think that that's a great tool to use.
Excellent. Any comments or questions for the infrastructure group? You can voice them or post in the chat. Sounds like you had a good discussion and were able to coalesce around some very specific ideas that could be actionable. Great work. All right, who wants to go next?
I can go next for access and education, but I'll ask my fellow committee members to jump in if I miss something. The good news is, I don't think we talked about any lobbying. It was all advocacy. Advocacy, not lobbying. So that's the good thing, right? Like we can all just charge forward with this. So, you know, there was a talk about integrating, I mean, there is, I guess, some lobbying, but we decided that we could get to where we wanted to go without necessarily lobbying. Integrating nutrition education, ag education, health education into standards, right? Right now, we have like an ag is cool program, but it kind of sits on the side. And there wasn't really a strong coalition, it sounds like, the last time around for integrating health standards. So, and like we know the makeup of our state house. So maybe the approach to take is one that was done with like farm to school, start with some pilots. We are ripe for a pilot here in Franklin County. But there's some just practical things that were raised, like, you know, during times of COVID, connecting with growers. It just makes it so much more difficult. And so that was something, you know, discussed. And then just kind of like navigating like the difference between the administrators and the school board and who are the gatekeepers, and, you know, how to get parents on board and, you know, and teachers. And so there was a lot of discussion around that. And then we had a quick discussion around SNAP Online. And while that isn't something that is a decision-making, like it wouldn't happen at the local level, it's using SNAP for online for retailers that aren't Amazon, right? Or I think there's like a couple that are enabled right now, but that it could really support our local small and mid-sized retailers. And so that it would be maybe more of like a kind of educational campaign around what that could do for our local retailers. We also then ended and had a super quick discussion around, transportation, although we did have a question. I don't know if anybody knows who entered yesterday the food routes. We didn't exactly know what they were referring to, and so we had a couple guesses of what that meant. So if you're on right now and you talked about food routes, let us know what that means. But the difference between like rural and urban and the role of public transportation, and something that I'm just going to throw in there that wasn't brought up was, during COVID, it's, I think, also a time that we can start talking about delivery and enabling that with SNAP. That's just my 2 cents to add in. So I think those are some of the main points, but I welcome any of the members to jump in if I missed something major.
Yeah, I had a quick question. If you're amending something that's already there, like STEM, how, and want to incorporate agriculture, how, can you do it STEAM? Is that a program amendment or a policy amendment? How do we tackle that to get that integrated?
I think it depends on how much leeway is in the original bill as to whether or not you can do it administratively or you have to get a new bill passed. I think you've got to look at each enabling legislation and if there's federal restrictions. I don't think there's one set answer to that.
So at least in Texas, the School Board of Ed, which is an elected body, so obviously you can't do candidate work on who gets there, but they are the entity charged with developing the skills required for graduation and advocating for a change in how those are described, or including, for example, agricultural requirements related to whatever you all are be working on. That would just be advocacy. None of that would be lobbying, because the school board, the candidates, you can't, encourage who to vote for on the candidate side, but they are just an implementing entity. So if you think back to the slide deck, the school board itself is not a legislative body. It's just changing the regulations related to what you need in order to graduate high school. And so all of that work to the school board doesn't count as lobbying, it's just advocacy. And you can craft whatever it is you want and show up and ask them to pass it.
Excellent. And Jill and Team Access and Education, what were the relationships that did you talk through the kind of key? I heard SNAP, but was there other relationships that you thought would be a priority to cultivate in moving this forward?
Well, there was certainly, getting, school administrators, teachers.
Farm to school.
Yeah. So, kind of that suite of folks. And then, for the others, we didn't really get into kind of the coalitions there.
Great work. All right, who's next? We have 2 more groups.
Go ahead. This is Lindsay, and we represented the farm group. And so as far as talking, and again, my group can pop in if I butcher this, too bad. But when talking about ideas or actions, so one of the big themes or things that we spoke about is the fact that our farmers don't really have a voice in the policy. So, and they don't really have a time to be able to be a part of that. So trying to figure out how to get them a part of that would be something we need to work on. And then also talking about land transfer, it being both a rural and an urban issue. So people might want access to land, but they don't actually have that generational wealth to be able to purchase the land. So definitely a challenge that they're seeing. And then also issues or challenges with farms having problems with distribution, those mid-sized to smaller sized farms, as well as one thing that I kind of represent. I'm from Huron County, and we don't have a council in our county, so that the fact that not all counties have a council. So again, I'm kind of speaking a little bit with not having a lot of background in this, so I apologize, but I'm coming from creating healthy communities, so certainly we want to bridge gaps, but we don't have that in our community, so, or in our county, so that's definitely an issue. And then lastly, as far as talking about the biggest impacts would be also some wages. We talked about the fact that wages on the food system, so not just the farm wages, but farm worker wages, but also the wages for food workers too, because if they're not getting paid well and they're not happy at work, that just kind of trickles down to the farms in a sense. So that was brought up, which was a great idea. And then moving forward, talking about relationships, just kind of what I touched on again just a little bit ago, but working with those farmers and really trying to get their voice to the table. And then how do we get a hold of them if they can't attend meetings? So trying to figure out how to build trust with them, get them involved when they already don't have enough time for that. You know, just making sure that we're being very cautious of their time. And then when we were talking a little bit on land transfers is really kind of how to get people connected with the ability to purchase the land. We didn't necessarily maybe feel that banks were the right route, but just trying to get people maybe connected with grants or whatever they would need in order to have access to that land. But we were cut off at that point. So that's as far as we got on this relationship piece.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing. Anyone want to build or ask any questions of the local farms group?
I have a question. Yesterday, it seemed that Tom Philpott, at one point he was talking about a need for more collective work around land issues. And I was wondering, in terms of your group, Lindsay, was there any discussion of that? And, you know, that's just such a big one. I'm not sure where we would even, I'm just curious, you know, if anyone's interested in looking at that in Ohio and what would be the next steps.
Yeah, I believe we got cut off before we even had the chance to really speak onto that scenario.
Okay.
Thanks. But anyone can chime in if anyone else from my group has an idea. Feel free to.
I was not in your group, but I have done a tiny bit of reading about agrarian land trusts, which I don't know if that was what Mr. Philpott was referring to, but that is a form of collective or kind of leveraging community resources to buy land as a group and then lease it affordably to community farmers for 99 years or however long. And then there's some agreement with the community so that the land is being farmed in a sustainable way and that the food is going to serve the local community. So there's a National Agrarian Trust, and I believe they are a 501c3, and they often coordinate purchasing land. So they raise the funds to purchase land once they have located a community of farmers and a community that is interested in that. And then the local community land trust would be a 501c2, I believe, kind of underneath that. And it would be managed partially by the community, partially by the farmers on the land, and partially, I think the National Agrarian Trust is kind of hands off, but they have some say in that management as well. So I know that's one model. I don't know if there are others, but I think that warrants further research.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing that experience you have, Carissa, and great question, Noreen. All right, we do have one more group. Let's hear from institutions.
Yes, I'm Cheryl Graffinino and with Columbus Public Health and Franklin County Local Food Council. And I was with the group talking about institutions. And again, I'll try to do my best to summarize what we talked about, but again, encourage my colleagues in that group to jump in with anything I missed. So a good portion of our conversation was really focused on the fact that institutions and institutional purchasing is really very intertwined with the infrastructure piece. That we have institutions that want to purchase local food. And if we look, for example, at some school districts, and I can use examples in Columbus, we have some small districts and some childcare centers that have done amazing things because they're serving a few thousand kids, maybe a few hundred kids. But then our larger school districts like the 3C, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Columbus, it's a lot more difficult to get the volumes and quantities that you need in the form that you need and be able to get it from Ohio. So we recognize that infrastructure was really important, and both at the institutional level. So for the institutions, so many of our institutions have moved to a heat and serve kind of model. And that's not just schools. Our hospitals do it, our colleges do it, those types of things. And a lot of the facilities that have been built in recent years don't have the infrastructure for food production. They're really just heat and serve kitchens. So looking at that infrastructure both there, but then also that middle supply chain infrastructure, because where we do sit is that there's a lot of heat and serve kitchens, and you're probably not going to turn that around immediately. So needing to continue to focus some energy on building that middle supply chain. So we really kind of framed our conversation in that. We thought that the way to really address that at the local level is, building those local partnerships to continue to help build the demand and drive the market in that way, and helping those institutions procure that local food. So helping them figure out how to get through those barriers, helping to connect them to those suppliers that can meet their needs, and helping them get creative about that. But we also looked at needing to leverage those local partnerships to pull levers at a larger scale. So things like pulling together, all of the local partnerships around Ohio. So the Franklin County Food Council, the Cleveland, the Cuyahoga County, the Dayton area, Cincinnati area, those types of things, to support bigger policy interventions, like things like providing increased reimbursement for schools when they buy Ohio food, or looking at ways to leverage existing tax incentive programs to help encourage the creation and development of the food infrastructure businesses, with the caveat of being careful that we don't use tax incentive programs that then cut funding to our schools, because if we lose funding to our schools, we've just shot ourselves in the foot with the idea of trying to get them to purchase more. So, really being conscious and building those partnerships with all of the stakeholders involved, so that we don't have unintended consequences from well-intended policies. So those were kind of the really key focus areas that we came up with in our discussion.
Excellent. Thank you, Cheryl, for sharing. Did anyone want to build or ask questions? The institutions group. What I liked and what I heard of what you said, Cheryl, is it felt like it tied the 2 days together, where even as we're pushing forward local policies on the council level, there needs to be that loop back to the state level to spread the lessons learned or model policy language or other things, which just highlights the importance of this network and the reason to keep having these kinds of conversations and interactions. So with that, I will let us close on, because I'm sure people are starting to get ready to prepare their dinners. So I just want to thank you all so much for sticking with us, for collaborating in this way, in this virtual format. I know you're going to be doing much more work along these lines in the coming weeks and months, and I'll pass it back to Beth to close us out.
Thank you all for hanging with us during this afternoon session. I hope you all got a lot out of it. Jen, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. And Dawn, thank you for your facilitation skills. They're so appreciated. Ohio Food Policy Network does have some opportunities coming up to get involved. Two specifically, if you were not able to join us yesterday, but still want to chime in with some ideas around policy efforts in those 4 categories we were discussing today, we will be reaching out to you to chime in. Second, after we hear back from everybody, we'll be doing some sorting and some cleaning up to consolidate some of those things, but we'll be coming back to you to ask for priorities. So those are 2 specific ways you'll be able to get engaged with this work specifically that we've started over the past couple of days. Additionally, in the new year, the Food Policy Network has a handful of committees that will be launching. So we have a policy committee, we have an engagement committee, we have a communications committee. If you are interested in participating in those, either pop your name into the chat box with the committee that you'd be interested in participating in, so that we can then reach out to you in the new year to round you up and allow you to get involved. We can't do this as individuals, and so this network really is important, and we need you, and we're happy to have you. So thank you all for participating over the past couple of days, and we look forward to reconnecting with you in the next couple of weeks.
Great. Thanks so much, all. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.